bem-vindos a mais uma sessão de conversas com Serralves, neste caso no eixo da paisagem. Esta tem sido a terceira sessão que realizamos nesta linha. Este programa, Conversas com Serralves, vai ao encontro da missão de Serralves de comunicar e divulgar ciência, numa aproximação destes temas com o grande público. Por coincidência, hoje é o dia de reabertura do parque, ao fim de 2 meses de estarmos fechados, e isso faz com que seja um dia mais especial do que o habitual. Lembro, antes de passar para inglês, aviso que o chat estará sempre ligado e operacional para colocarem qualquer questão em qualquer devido tempo. No final poderão colocar essas questões, as vossas questões diretamente com a funcionalidade de levantar a mão, ou então, se for necessário, poderei fazer a tradução de qualquer uma das formas. Para quem nos está a ver, também há uma funcionalidade que permite colocar legendas em português no Teams, para quem tiver a aplicação instalada. Por isso, convido as pessoas, se assim acharem mais simples, de o fazerem. So, welcome, Corinne. Welcome to Serralves, to Serralves Talks. I was just saying that today was a very special day for the park. Because it was the reopening after two months of being closed. So nature never stops, so we never stopped in the park, in the maintenance part of the parks. We were really busy. But today is the reopening, so we are finally together with our visitors, and people can enjoy the park at the most. And it was a really nice day. I don't know what is the weather in England, but it was a really sunny day, and we had quite a few people, so it was nice. So thank you, Corinne, for being here. We know each other since 2013, when we worked together at Brest Park. I was a volunteer / apprentice for 3 months. And you were the upper garden was responsible for the upper gardens, if I remember correctly. And you were kind enough to rent me your daughter's room, so I could stay find a room easy in England and give me lifts. So you were a very important person at that time, and I've been a very good friend since then. And when we started working in this program about landscape, I remember all your talks and the talks that you usually do to promote the garden that you're working on, and all the knowledge that you have. You have a slide that is, thank you for doing that, but behind you there's a really big bookshelf of books on landscape. And I remember was the first thing that I when I entered your house, I was like amazed for the books that you had on gardening. So thank you very much for being here and for bringing the Swiss garden to the Portuguese public. It's not a well-known, I would say, a well-known type of garden, especially here in Portugal. And so I thought it was really interesting to shine a light on that. Just a quick introduction to you, Corinne. You are a bachelor degree in art history, and you are a full member of the Chartered Institute of Horticulture. You started working in public parks in Cardiff, and then you worked in the National Trust, and then in the English Heritage at Brest Park. At the moment, you are the Garden Heritage and Audience Development Manager for the Shuttleworth Trust at the Swiss Garden of Bedfordshire. Once again, thank you very much, and let's talk a little bit of this type of garden. and bring some light to what is a Swiss garden doing in the middle of the UK.
Thank you, Ricardo. I shall start sharing my screen now. I shall just find my file. Here we go. Okay. I hope everybody can see that.
Yes, we can.
That's good. Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today about the Swiss garden. You're absolutely right, Ricardo. It's not very well known at all, even in the UK, I don't think, because we're not associated with anybody particularly famous. So we never had Jane Austen visiting our garden, and we weren't associated with Shakespeare or Capability Brown or anyone like that. So it does mean that we have to work quite hard to be well known. But I hope I'm doing a good enough job of getting out there and telling people the story of the Swiss garden. And I think we are raising the garden's profile a little more, especially since it was restored back in 2012 to 14. It underwent a very significant restoration project, and it is looking fabulous. And we are working very hard now to raise the garden's profile and invite people to come and share this lovely garden with us. So I'm going to start by showing you, this is a bit of a work in progress map, but it does give you an idea of the Shuttleworth visitor attraction. So a little bit of background, we are based in Bedfordshire, which is in the east of England. We're about 40 miles or 50 miles north of London. So just to get your bearings, if you're not from the UK. And the estate, the Old Warden estate, is actually around 5,000 acres in total. And what I'm showing you here is just a snapshot of that estate. The estate includes a lot of farms, it includes the village of Old Warden, and here you can see the visitor attraction area of the site. So I'm not sure if my pointer is going to work, but if you can see it, we have the Shuttleworth house over here in the top left-hand corner. And I'll be telling you a little bit more detail about the history of all this as we go through. And here we have the Shuttleworth collection of historic aircraft, all of which flies, and we have regular air shows on site. So it's a multifaceted visitor attraction. There's a lot going on. And then behind these hangars, we have the 9-acre Swiss garden, and you can see the entirety of the garden here with its, winding paths and ponds. And so I will be going into a lot more detail about this, obviously, throughout the talk, but I just wanted to give you a little bird's eye view of the garden. And then up here we have the estate lake. So the garden is adjacent to a little woodland walk also, and the woodland walk is, I've lost my pointer now, that's disappeared somewhere. The woodland walk is sort of at the top right hand of the garden here and walks alongside the lake here. So it's a very nice walk, which is adjacent to the garden. Okay, moving on from there. Another bird's eye view, but this time aerial photographs. We're very fortunate to have the aeroplanes next door to us, because now and again we can bribe a photographer to go up there and take some lovely aerial shots of the garden. So these were taken before the recent restoration. So the tree canopy here is quite heavy. It has been significantly reduced to open up view lines across the garden, which were part of its original design. But you can still see the general sort of layout here. We've got the broad walk up here. We've got the pond layouts down here. And then here, this is particularly significant. This is the Swiss cottage on its mound, and this is a focal point of the garden, and many of the very important views and vistas of the garden radiate out from this Swiss cottage and also towards it from different areas of the garden. So that is quite a significant building and very much a focal point as we go through the garden design story. So I'm going to introduce you first to the family who created, or one of the members of this family who created the Swiss garden back in the 1820s. And though the 1820 marked the official end of the Regency period, we still call it a sort of late Regency garden, because in terms of fashions and styles, the Regency period did carry on for a period of time after 1820. So this is just a little snapshot of the family of Lord Ongley, going back to the Sir Samuel Ongley, who actually bought up parcels of land in Bedfordshire and created the Old Warden estate in the 1690s. And then various nephews of his inherited for a while. And then we get to the Robert Henley Ongleys, the first, second and third barons. And the third baron is the one who created the garden in the 1820s. He completed it in 1832. And I've just put a few images at the bottom of this page to show you some of the other key buildings and structures around the estate, which are sort of connected to the family. So here we have Queen Anne's summer house. This is the bottom left picture. And this was created, we think, by the first Sir Samuel Ongley when he was knighted by Queen Anne in 1713. And this is now managed by the Landmark Trust, who actually rent it out as a holiday let. And it's beautiful inside. I've actually stayed in it myself, and it's a very, very lovely holiday let on the Old Warden estate. The second picture along is the Ongley Mausoleum. And this was built in 1790, when the first Baron Ongley had passed away, and in his will he left instructions for this to be built. And the Ongley family have been they're all sort of buried or resting in the mausoleum since then. And the third picture along is one of the little buildings, one of the little structures in the village of Old Warden. And I just wanted to point out that it is very similar in style to some of the things that we see in the Swiss garden today. And there's a reason for that, which I'll elaborate on later. And then the fourth picture is the St Leonard's Church, which is in Old Warden. And Lord Ongley, when he was creating the gardens and remodelling the village, he also completely refitted the Church of St Leonard's here as well. This is the only image we have of Lord Ongley with his horse Coventry, and the Ongleys were very keen horsemen. They liked riding, they liked racing, hunting, and so it isn't really a great surprise that the image here is of his horse, and the horse looks very, very large in comparison to Lord Ongley. So they're very much focusing on the horse here, but it's the only known image we have of Lord Ongley. Likewise, the image of Warden House. This is taken from the sale particulars of 1872 when Lord Ongley sold the estate to the Shuttleworth family. And this is the only image that I've ever seen, and I don't know that there are any others of the house before it was demolished by the Shuttleworth family and rebuilt. We don't know exactly what the influences were behind Lord Ongley's creation of a Swiss garden in Bedfordshire. It is quite unusual to think of a Swiss garden being developed in this area of the world, because we have a very flat landscape in Bedfordshire. We don't have mountains, we don't have particularly large hills either, really. So it is a little bit unusual, perhaps, to think that somebody might want to design a garden in the Swiss style here in Bedfordshire. So unfortunately, we don't have very much in the way of documentary evidence from Ongley's time. He didn't leave any papers behind, any accounts, any plans, any designs for the garden, any diaries. We don't have anything like that, sadly. So very much what we have to go on is what we have on the site. You know, we have the buildings and the structures themselves, the design of the garden, we have the archaeology of the garden, and we have sometimes some idea of what was going on in contemporary fashions around the time as well. So we know, for instance, that many people were doing their grand tours of Europe at the time. The Napoleonic Wars had ended, so Europe had opened up the gates again, and we know that Lord Ongley's mother travelled to Switzerland. Perhaps he didn't, but it's likely that he did. So it's more than likely that he saw something or visited somewhere in Switzerland which he took a liking to, and he decided to try to recreate that in Bedfordshire. And when you look at this picture in the top right here of the Alps in the distance there, and the foothills in particular are the bit I'd like you to look at, because we think this is obviously the more realistic goal that he was aiming for in the Swiss garden. And if you look at all the ingredients of that picture, so you've got a sort of an undulating landscape, quite green. You have an evergreen backdrop. You have buildings dotted around the place, and very, very likely you've got the water runoff from the mountains creating ponds and lakes as well. So you've got all the ingredients there, which you would see later on in Lord Ongley's design of his Swiss garden. And he has included all of those elements in his design. On the left-hand side and the one below that, the two black and white images, they were taken from a garden known as White Knights, which was in Reading, which is now the campus of the Reading University, actually. But at the time, White Knights, it was owned by the 5th Duke of Marlborough, who also lived at Blenheim Palace, so he's famous for Blenheim Palace, and he had created this garden called White Knights, and it was very, very famous. Many people in the UK would have been visiting gardens like this, and you can see that some of the structures here, the very rustic structures, they're very similar in style, as is the Floral Arch, to some of the things that we have in the Swiss garden. And so these styles were already around. And he wasn't really doing anything too new in the way of, you know, the detail of the design. White Knights is no longer there. It was demolished in the 1840s, so we only have these images today. We also know that Humphrey Repton, the famous landscape designer, he was working at Woburn Abbey, which isn't too far away from here, in the early 1800s, I think around 1813 to 1815. For the Duchess of Bedford, and the Duchess of Bedford was actually at the opening of the Swiss garden in 1832. So she and Lord Ongley knew each other, and apparently they led the dancing together at the opening event, which is quite nice. So Humphrey Repton may well have been an influence as well. And of course, there were all sorts of people writing architectural design books. We had J.B. Papworth, Loudon. There were lots of people who were advocating the use of the cottage ornate style and similar architectural devices in landscape design. So all of these things were happening at around the time that Lord Ongley would have been thinking about his Swiss garden and how to go about creating it. So we think that there were many influences at play here. I don't think there was just one. And of course, at the same time, we've got the picturesque movement in play as well. So there were lots of different types of influence that he could have taken from. So this is what we think was going on at the time. I just wanted to add this in because the village of Old Warden, when Lord Ongley created the garden, he also remodelled the village in a Swiss style. And the evidence for this comes from this sort of account where somebody was asked, was it Lord Ongley who looked after the people? The answer was yes. The people all wore red handkerchiefs like the Swiss, and it was his lordship's hobby to have the village look like a Swiss village. So the village and the garden were obviously a set piece. It wasn't a garden of its own as a one-off, you know, as a separate thing to the rest of the estate. He very much wanted it to look like a Swiss landscape. And the story goes that he would ride through the village and the villagers would all be out of their doorways in their red neckties, so that it looked the part for Lord Ongley and his friends as they rode through the village. Now, when you think of a Swiss cottage, you would probably think of something that looks a little bit like this. And a few people have attributed our Swiss cottage to Peter Frederick Robinson, but we don't actually have any evidence at all that he was involved with the design of our Swiss cottage. But he was involved with the design of a Swiss cottage in Regent's Park in London, which is the picture at the bottom. And that was demolished in the 1870s. And I've got a little story about that coming up later, which might just connect our Swiss cottage to that one somehow. More of that later. But this is the sort of Swiss cottage that most people would expect to see in a Swiss garden. Ours doesn't look very much like that. And we think that actually Lord Ongley was going more towards the cottage ornate style rather than a Swiss cottage, such as these, because these are the sort of cottages we've got in the village, and many of these still demonstrate the architectural interventions of Lord Ongley, and I would say very much the cottage ornate style is coming in here rather than any specific Swiss style, although there might be little bits and bobs around the place that might lend themselves to that. And it is a very picturesque village. It's a delightful village. If you're driving through, it's a very chocolate box village to look at. So the recipe for Lord Ongley's picturesque vision, what was it? Now, manipulating the natural landscape was a big part of it. The land on which he created the garden was a clay brick field. So it's a 9-acre garden. I don't know if I said that before, but it's at 9 acres in total. And it was sitting on a clay brick field, and there was no garden there at all. In fact, a road used to run through it, and his father had the road removed in 1805. So we don't know whether his father had any plans to create a garden here, but he definitely had the road removed for some reason. And Lord Ongley created the mounds and the undulations in the garden by digging out the ponds, basically, and he used the spoil from these ponds to create these lovely little mounds on which he built small buildings. So here we have the Swiss cottage on top of its little mound, and it's a little bit of a confusing, it's a little bit of an illusion that he's created here, because from this vantage point, it looks like a single-story building on top of a mound. If you were to go round to the other side, you would find that there is actually a story beneath that. There is a lower floor, and it's actually built into the mound, so you can only see it from one side. And from every other direction, it just looks like a single-story building on top of that mound. So there's a little bit of illusionary stuff going on here. He's got little surprises for you around the corner. But it's a beautiful little building. But as I said, it's much more in the style of, say, the Papworth cottage ornate designs, rustic architecture, perhaps not so much the Swiss style as such. Woodland backdrops, there used to be a heavier evergreen tree canopy in the garden. It's much more mixed nowadays because there have been several interventions over the years from the county council and what have you. So there's been a lot more planting since Ongley's day, but we still have a pretty good evergreen backdrop to those little buildings, so it still retains the magic of his alpine garden. Rustic stylized buildings, I've talked about that already. Attention to detail, I'm referring here to those views and vistas throughout the garden that are so essential to the design. And wherever you are, you know, there's a very obvious attention to where those views go and how they are organised within the garden design. And I don't think that was accidental. It's quite obvious that Ongley meant for those views. Many of them are actually framed by arches, so we've got quite a few lovely ornamental arches within the garden design, and they frame those views beautifully, which of course is very much in line with the picturesque theories. So that's quite important, and we have to be very careful not to plant things right in those important view lines. We mustn't disrupt those view lines. The eclectic influences, I've also talked about all of those. Given that we don't have the documentary evidence, we have to make those assumptions, and we have to sometimes, you know, try to make those connections. Community was very important in the creation of the garden. I like this quote from an 1832 newspaper, which talks about the Swiss cottage, which is about half a mile from the house, a beautiful building situated in the midst of a perfectly fairy ground, which his lordship has formed from time to time according to his own taste, to the great advantage of his poor tenantry, who have thus been kept in continual employment. So many of the people in the village were employed to create the garden for Lord Ongley. And I have been told, and I don't have any evidence, and I don't know that there is any actual evidence, but that it was somebody from the village who actually built the Swiss cottage. So he definitely kept things local. We don't know that anybody well known was involved with the design of this garden. Certainly nobody has ever, we've not found any records from anybody. So we did wonder about Papworth, but he wasn't working in this area at the time. So as far as we know, Lord Ongley designed it himself and got his local estate workers and tenants to help with that. I'm just going to show you now some examples of the original Ongley features. Most of the garden, even though the Shuttleworth family embellished parts of it later on, most of the garden is in its original form, we believe. And these are some of the structures that haven't been embellished at all. They're exactly as they were during Ongley's period. The stained glass window here is in the little chapel. It's a very small building with a Gothic door. It has a Venetian window on one side, and then on this side we have this gorgeous stained glass window. And you can see how the sunlight plays with that on the marble tablet on the windowsill there. And on a sunny day, you can get some wonderful colours and shadows and things going on in there. Beautiful little building with a wonderful brick floor. Unfortunately not open at the moment because of COVID restrictions, but normally it is open to the public. The tablet on the windowsill is actually a biblical text, and that used to sit on the porch of St Leonard's Church in the village when Lord Ongley remodelled that. When the Shuttleworth family came on board, they removed it from the church and brought it to the garden, and it now sits on the windowsill of the chapel, and it's actually a very fitting place for it. The lovely little curly bridges, as I call them, there are two bridges like this in the Swiss garden. They were made by Cato and Sons in the 1830s. This is the North Bridge. It is very steep. It is quite difficult to go up it, and it's even more difficult to come down the other side. We don't know why it was designed in this shape because it is not easy to cross, but you can just about see to the left of it there is a footbridge, a flat footbridge, which enables our visitors to safely cross the bridge without having to dare to go over the very high one here. So, but it's a very ornamental feature, and it does create beautiful reflections in the ponds, and that's possibly why it was created with that very, very high arch. But beautiful ironwork. Obviously here it's in the snow, but I think I'm fairly sure I've got some more pictures of it coming up later. The rose arches in the bottom left, these are the beautiful ironwork rose arches. The garden has a lot of ironwork in it, and that was one of the significant things about Lord Ongley's design. Lots of ornate ironwork, and that has all been recently restored. And these rose arches, they're the original rose arches, and the roses, I'm glad to say, have recovered very nicely from they were bagged up. Literally, they had black bags over them for 18 months, but they've come back and they're flowering beautifully again. So that's another one of the original features. And then the final one here I've got is it's a poem on a tablet, and the poem is called The Forgotten One. And there are hints that Lord Ongley meant for the garden to be also a memorial to somebody, because there are a couple of these poems about lost ones in the garden. And there is also a walk just behind that called the Melancholy Walk. And so we do feel that part of the garden, at least, was meant as a sort of memorial, perhaps to his father, maybe his brother who died young. We're not sure, but the poems are about people who are not with us anymore, and therefore, you know, we think that perhaps there's an element of that going on. And there are some things that were lost and have never been replaced. In the top left-hand corner here, you can see a statue. Apparently, this was a statue of Lord Ongley in empirical costume. He was clad a little bit like a Roman emperor. That, unfortunately, was broken up when the garden fell into decline in the 1970s, and apparently a lot of vandalism occurred before it was restored again. So this statue didn't survive that, unfortunately, but apparently there was a lot of statuary in the garden back in the day, and it's all been lost over the years. We don't have much of it left now, unfortunately. And the tree seat, this lovely little thatched tree seat in the bottom right, I say at the mercy of time and decay, because the tree, of course, trees sometimes, you know, become unwell and have to be felled. And unfortunately, this one did. It was full of some kind of pathogen. Unfortunately, it started dropping big limbs all over the place and had to be felled. So therefore, the tree seat had to come down. We have the original iron band that attaches the thatched canopy to the tree, and that iron band is the only thing that is left of Lord Ongley's tree seat. Obviously the canopy was a later one, and the seat would have been a later one, but we still have that iron band. So we have replaced the tree with a different species altogether, actually, a cedar. That was an oak that was there before, and we've put a tree seat around it, and when the tree is big enough, we will be able to attach a thatched canopy to it, but we're looking at, say, 3 or 4 decades off yet. It's got to be big enough. It's way too young at the moment, and it wouldn't hold the weight. And another lost building was the aviary, and at the top you can see a black and white photograph, and in the distance, under the arch and in the distance, there is perhaps you can see it, perhaps you can't. It's a structure of some sort, and that was the aviary. Unfortunately, as you can see from the picture on the right, it is now just a ruin, and all we have is the brick foundation base of the structure, and we have absolutely no idea what it looked like. And we're hoping that somebody will come forward with a photograph, a close-up photograph of the aviary, so that we can know exactly what it looked like. In the meantime, this computer-generated image on the bottom here is just an idea of what it might have looked like, complete with Mr. Darcy on the right here, and a couple of, I'm not even sure what they are. Are they peacocks, or I'm not even sure what those white ones are. Anyway, but as you can see, there are birds in the aviary, and it's all looking very, very nice and Regency-fied, but we're not sure that it looked exactly like that because we just don't have any plans, no images, nothing. And the archaeology can tell us a little bit, but it doesn't tell us what it looked like. So we're still hoping that somebody will come forward with some evidence for that. So Lord Ongley, he finished the garden in 1832, and by the 1850s he had moved on and he had leased the estate. So there was a tenant in residence from then on, and he moved away. But in 1872, he put the estate up for sale. And this is a lovely example of a page from those sale particulars in 1872. And it's actually got the description of the Swiss cottage or arboretum, sort of halfway down there. And it does go on in further pages to actually detail some of the buildings in the garden quite well. So we have a very good snapshot of what the garden contained at the point of sale in 1872, before the Shuttleworth family came in and made their changes to the buildings and structures, because they did embellish things quite significantly. So it's good to get a snapshot of what they looked like before that. And that's just a nice little introduction to the sale particulars there. And on the right, we have Joseph Shuttleworth, a northern industrialist who bought the estate in 1872. This is just a little bit of information about the Shuttleworth squires, because we're moving on now from the Ongley family into the Shuttleworth era. And Joseph Shuttleworth, who bought the estate, he co-founded Clayton and Shuttleworth, an engineering company in Lincoln, when he married the daughter of Mr. Clayton. And that was a very successful company. And when he acquired Old Warden Park in 1874, he demolished the mansion that I showed you earlier, the Ongley house, and embellished the garden. So more of that to come. Following on from him, we had his son Frank, also a director of Clayton and Shuttleworth, High Sheriff of Bedfordshire, etc., etc. He married Dorothy Lang, the vicar's daughter, in 1902, and they went on to have Richard Shuttleworth, who tragically died at the age of 31 in a flying accident. So that's just a little snapshot of the family there. And I've just put this at the bottom just to explain that Dorothy actually set up the Shuttleworth Trust in memory of Richard when he died. And the Old Warden Park is now owned by the Richard Ormond Shuttleworth Remembrance Trust. So yes, so that's, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about some of those people now. But first, this is the house that Shuttleworth built. So he demolished the Ongley mansion, and here you've got the neo-Jacobean pile that they put up in its place, along with the wonderful, and you can see how flat Bedfordshire is from this image, actually. You know, I was saying earlier that we don't have any mountains or significant hills. Well, you can see the proof in that here. It's quite a flat county. But you know, you can see quite a bit of the parkland here, which is lovely. There's a ha-ha which runs behind the house here. This is the ha-ha here, and the Swiss garden is off in this direction, and the lovely parkland beyond there, which is lovely. And just some detail really around the house. This is the front door. One of the rooms, this is the dining room, and this is the little summer house. And the story goes that when Dorothy Shuttleworth formed the college, the Shuttleworth College first, some of the early students in the 1960s remember being served sherry in the summer house with Dorothy at Christmas time. And they also have some very good memories of the garden, and several of them took photographs of the garden back in the 1960s, which is quite useful for us today. Here we have Dorothy and Frank, and there they are getting married in June 1902. And there's Dorothy in her later years, and also Richard Shuttleworth in the bottom right, their son. And these are some lovely photographs of the family using the gardens. And of course, this is one of the things we don't have from Ongley's period, although we can imagine that the Ongley family would have loved taking tea in the Swiss cottage, in their little miniature cottage. But we don't have any evidence of that, and we certainly don't have photographs from their period. But what we do have from the Shuttleworth period is these lovely black and white images of the family and also the villagers enjoying the gardens. And in the top right, we have one of Dorothy's little dogs. She and Frank honeymooned in Japan, and she ever after, she was a big fan of all things Japanese, and one of the things that she was passionate about was these little Japanese chin dogs, and she has several of them. And we actually have the dog cemetery in the Swiss garden now, where they are all buried, which is a really lovely feature of the garden. And the picture on the top right is one of those little dogs on the tree seat, and I can just about see, and on the bottom of that picture, the shadow of what looks like a woman's head and shoulders. And I like to think that that is Dorothy in the garden with one of her little dogs, with the tree seat. And there's lots of ivy around the tree. You can see that it's covered in ivy. It's just a beautiful little snapshot of perhaps Dorothy's time in the garden. And we don't know who all the people are in these photographs, but it's just a really lovely reflection of the garden and what it looked like also. I mean, in the background of the top left picture, you can see the dolphin tatsler, which is one of the garden features still there today. And you can see that it's planted up quite heavily. We don't plant it today because we're worried about the conservation aspects of doing that. And also the bedding schemes around it, you can see in the background there. So it is quite interesting to look at these old photographs and look at, you know, the trees and the plants and see what was going on back in the early 1900s, planting wise. And their changes to the garden involved some quite delicate changes, really, that in my view, enhanced the garden rather than, it wasn't detrimental to Lord Ongley's garden at all. I think they embellished it in a really sensitive way. They added features that brought the garden up to date. So obviously we're now talking about the Victorian period. So their embellishments were very much in keeping with their own time, but they also respected and kept all of the buildings and structures that Lord Ongley had put in the 1820s. So the first, on the top left, we have a picture of the grotto. The Shuttleworth family commissioned the Pullums to come and create several artificial rock structures called Pullamite. So this the material that they're made out of is called Pullamite, from the family name of the Pullums, and they created several of these features in the garden, and probably the most significant one is the Grotto Infernory. And in Lord Ongley's day, this was a conservatory housing his collection of, you know, exotic plants or what have you. We know he had a heated conservatory, but when the Shuttleworth family came along, they changed this building. So the interior tunnels, there were two just plain brick-lined tunnels leading into the glazed area of the conservatory, and those tunnels were lined by the Pullum family with the most amazing sort of grotto effect rockwork, and you can see that in the top left-hand picture there. And it was planted up with ferns, so very much in the Victorian fashion for ferneries. The Shuttleworth family basically repurposed the conservatory that Lord Ongley had and turned it into what is now known as the Grotto Infernory. So they didn't change the building at all apart from this. It was just completely repurposed. And on the right we have the terrace. So they created a raised terrace, and the two images at the bottom are the views from that terrace. The first view from the early 1900s in the Shuttleworth family's day, and the second as it more like what it is today, although the dolphin tatsler is normally planted up with seasonal bedding. But apart from that, it is pretty much the view that we have today. So those are the views from the terrace, and I think that was a really lovely way to showcase Ongley's garden. It was like a raised platform. They created a raised platform from which to showcase the garden and see it with you know, from a raised view, really, which is actually very complementary to the Ongley's garden design. And I've included this because the Shuttleworth family included one additional feature. They created the pond cascade out of the Pulhamite, though the Pulham family created the pond cascade feature. In Ongley's day, this was stepping stones going over from one side to the other, but the Shuttleworth family decided they wanted a bridge. So the Clayton and Shuttleworth Bridge is this pale blue, beautiful little bridge with its lattice balustrading, very pretty, and in my view, again, it really enhances the garden that Ongley had. So you've got the two bridge views now, the original Humpbacked Bridge, as we call it, which is very popular with wedding photography these days. We often have brides posing on these bridges. And as you can see, the view from one to the other is very complementary and works very well. They work very well together. Here we have some further evidence of changes that were made to the garden in the early 1900s. You see on this map, it's quite clear, particularly the ponds here. You can see the pond layouts very clearly. The Swiss cottage is over here, and this is the shape of the Grotto Infernory, or what used to be Ongley's conservatory. It's actually a cruciform shape, not quite straight, the tunnels, and we think that's because they were designed so that when you were entering through one door, you couldn't see straight through. There was a little bit of mystery. You had to sort of go, you know, into the centre to see what was going on. And what I'm drawing your attention to here is this little building here, or structure on the map, which is a 4-bay structure quite clearly outlined here on the map from about 1901. And we have also found this plan in the archives of a pheasantry that was proposed for Joseph Shuttleworth in 1876. And we believe that that is the structure that was in this corner of the garden for raising young birds, for the shoot, presumably, or maybe ornamental pheasants, we're not sure. But today, this is the rock garden. So at some point, the pheasantry was removed and this became a rock garden, which has also got some Pulhamite rockwork involved in the structure. It's also got a lot of sandstone, so it's not all Pulhamite, but the base layer is Pulhamite and then sandstone is built on top to create the rock garden. So it's interesting looking back on these old maps, and the road that used to run through the garden when it was a brick field would have gone roughly along this line, we believe, here as well. So these are the 1960s. So we're coming to the end of the Shuttleworth era. Dorothy Shuttleworth died in 1968. So this is a year before then. And these images were taken by one of the students that was at Shuttleworth College back in the day. And this is very interesting again, because again, we can look at the planting. We can see that the garden is quite overgrown. We can see inside the grotto again, and this image here is quite interesting because I had absolutely no idea that this statuary was inside the grotto ever. I've never seen that image before until very recently. So, you know, we're learning all the time about how the Shuttleworth family used the gardens and what sort of items they had inside the grotto, etc. And this is this interesting image at the bottom here. We have recently had quite a lot of trouble with leaks in the pond linings, and we've had to have them fixed. And it turns out that the problem was these trees here. They were felled a number of years ago, but the root systems underground have since decayed, and they were allowing cavities to form. And of course, you know, water likes a cavity, so it was actually creating a bit of a problem when we sprung a leak. Thankfully, that has now been fixed. And this is the sad part of the story. This is the 1970s, and after Dorothy Shuttleworth passed away, the garden fell into a period of decline, quite serious decline, as you can see from the images. The thatch on the Swiss cottage is not looking good. You can see the interior of the Swiss cottage here on the top right. debris all over the place, windows not looking too good. One of the Swiss cottage doors was actually found in a pond, so somebody had literally ripped it off and thrown it in a pond. So there was a lot of vandalism, there was a lot of neglect, and that basically it just wasn't being looked after at all. And you can see from the state of the grotto dome here that plants were literally just sort of, you know, growing out of it, and panes of glass gone. Very, very sad story. Thankfully, concerned neighbours raised the alarm to the local council, and the council agreed to take on a lease of the garden from the Shuttleworth Trust and to restore the garden and look after it. And that is what they did. And at the same time, the Friends of the Swiss Garden were formed. Today, there are 500 members of the Swiss Garden Friends, and they all pay an annual membership, which gives them access to the garden. And of course, those monies go towards looking after the garden and paying for sort of restoration projects, etc. So the county council stepped in, restored the garden in the 1970s. But of course, as they were paying out all this money to restore the garden and maintain it from there on, an income was needed to do this. So for the first time ever, it became basically a commercial entity, and the garden was open to the public, and weddings were held there from then on. And it is still a very, very popular destination for weddings. It's the Swiss Cottage is a delightful venue for a small wedding. You can only get 20 people inside it, but you can get about 80 people all around it if you have all the doors and windows open and they can still hear what's going on. So it is a very unusual and unique wedding venue, and still very, very popular. And the fact that we have peacocks in the garden also helps. They're very popular with the brides as well for the photographs, etc. So the garden became a commercial entity in the early 1980s, which is when it opened its doors to the public. And as you can see, the restoration of the grotto there looking pretty good. And following on from that, around 40 years after that, the garden was yet again falling into decline. As you probably are fully aware, nothing stands still in a heritage garden, and thatch needs replacing every so often. Rustic buildings, because of the materials that they're made out of, they're not going to last forever, and they need regular work. So we were getting to a point, I think, in the sort of early 2000s when the garden was starting to look a little bit ropey again, and we quickly realised that it was going to need a little bit of an injection of cash to make it look great again. And we were successful with a bid to the Heritage Lottery Fund in 2012 for a very significant grant, which enabled us to completely restore the garden. And this included all the path networks, all the buildings and structures, you know, so it was a pretty comprehensive restoration. Most of the money went on the Capital Works programme, and a little bit was left aside for the activity plan, which I was heavily involved with, which meant basically audience development in the shape of learning and apprenticeships, volunteering, community engagement, partnerships, interpretation. We needed to tell the garden story in a better way, and we needed to run events and activities which complement the garden but also appeal to a wider audience. So those are all the sorts of things we've been doing ever since, and of course also looking after its future. So it's not just about restoring the garden, it's also about ensuring that as we go forward we are maintaining the garden with a view to not letting it go into serious decline again. And you know, we're trying to fix things as we go, really, and make sure that we're actually taking that responsibility seriously. So we now have a conservation management plan in place that does need reviewing. It's 7 years since the garden reopened, and we do need to review the conservation management plan going forward, but we have one in place, and it's a very helpful document in ensuring that we put the right practices into place for looking after this very special garden. And some of the techniques that we used for the restoration were quite innovative. This is an example of taking the paint and rust off the ironwork in the garden. Now this is the Floral Arch, and the Floral Arch rises about 7 meters off the ground. It's a very big arch, as you can probably see. And this chap is basically, it's a very high pressure jet of steam, and it's taking off the paint and it's taking off the rust and anything that shouldn't be there. And what you're left with is a really clean piece of ironwork for you to repaint. And the beauty of doing it like this and not using any abrasive methods is that it doesn't take away the surface of the metal. You know, you still retain the original surface. So if that surface has got dimpling in it, you retain that. You don't end up with a very flat, shiny surface where it wasn't before. So it's quite a quick method, although people using this method can only work on these jets for about 20 minutes. They have to take breaks because of the hand-arm vibration issues surrounding it. So health and safety does play a big factor in these things, of course. But it's a very effective way of getting the paint off. And these are just some images of the Swiss cottage when it was undergoing its restoration. And so you can see that the scaffolding is up on the left-hand side here and the thatch is going on. And it was really interesting to see all this at play. We tried to find people, of course, with the right skills, the right heritage skills, which is actually getting quite difficult these days, to find people with the right, using the old traditional methods rather than all the new ones. Excuse me. And but we had apprenticeships running at the same time. So the people using all these heritage skills, they are also able to pass those skills on to other people in the process of the restoration. So that's very important. And on the right, you've got the finished product, the Swiss cottage as after restoration, looking lovely with the sunset behind it. This was the nice thing about being in the garden of an evening when we're having one of our events. You're in the right place at the right time, so we get the photographer in. There's an interesting little story around the interior of the Swiss cottage. The image here, the little image of the panelling on its own here, is the inside of our Swiss cottage. Beautiful panelling inside. But we believe that this was introduced by the Shuttleworth family when they took over the garden. And we believe that Lord Ongley's Swiss cottage was a lot plainer, a lot simpler. It may not have been very fancy inside at all. What we've discovered recently, is that the interior of the Swiss cottage at Regent's Park in London, the interior was extremely similar, if not identical, to the panelling that we have in our Swiss cottage in Bedfordshire. And the shape of the doors also, there's a lovely sort of, I don't even know what you would call that shape. It's almost like a moustache or something at the top there, but it's a very unusual door shape. But our doors at the Swiss cottage are also shaped like that. And the ceiling here, the ceiling decoration, which is, it's not very clear here, but it is actually beveled and painted to look like bamboo. And I think you've got them up here, you can just see, but that's also identical to the one in London. And then we found out that the Swiss cottage in London was being demolished at the same time that the Shuttleworths were restoring the Swiss garden in Bedfordshire. We also found out that the land agents who were organising the sale of the old Warden estate for Shuttleworth, for Mr. Shuttleworth, were also responsible for the demolition of the Swiss cottage in Regent's Park. So there are too many coincidences, really, and we do believe that we may have somehow acquired some of the decorations here from that Swiss cottage in London, and that they've been put into our Swiss cottage by Joseph Shuttleworth when he was restoring it. And we have been told by conservation teams that these have been cut to fit our building. They are not bespoke made for the building. So it's, you know, there's a lot of coincidental evidence, but it's quite strong. This is the outside of the Swiss cottage. You can see the lovely decoration in the porch here on the ceiling of the porch. And this is all made out of, and even all this twig work here, all of this rustic decoration is created from willow and hazel twigs, and also Monterey pine cones. And the pine cones, this is the sort of centerpiece really of a Monterey pine cone, and it's actually just nailed, they're nailed to the ceiling here. And you can just see the dark ones are the original ones, and the paler ones are the ones that have been added during the restoration. So we've tried to keep as much of the original cones as possible, and then more twig work around the edges here in the detail. But the whole thing is just really beautifully done. Even the doors, it's all twig work. It's all very rustic and beautiful. And this is just the finishing touches of the Swiss cottage. And one of the ladies who visited the garden in 1835, Emily Shaw, she actually described the golden pill on top, or oh, sorry, she called it a gilded pill. She said that the Swiss cottage had a gilded pill, and we think that this is what she meant by the gilded pill. Although in those days it also had a white stone dove sitting atop it, but that hasn't been recreated. But they do catch the light very well, these gilded pills. And this is just some more restoration, just to say really about the bridges. This is a lovely detail of those curly bridges, as I call them. And these are the Cato and Sons bridges, which have these gorgeous sort of circular ends. It's actually big enough for a child to get into the middle of. If they go all the way around and in, they can sort of just about get in there, and they do like to do that. And then also this is an image of the restoration of the Grotto Infernory in progress, and they're painting. It's actually St Pancras blue is the colour of the paint. So we have got some unusual paint colours going on as well. But apparently Lord Ongley's garden was full of colour. According to Emily Shaw, it was in very bad taste and full of colour. And she wasn't all that keen on it, but she was about 15 at the time. So I don't know how seriously we take that. And I've just included these commendations because obviously, you know, the restoration was quite a significant one. And it was really nice afterwards to be nominated, I suppose, for quite a few commendations and accreditations, and very nice to be a part of that. Planting plans. Very difficult to know exactly what we have from Lord Ongley's period because we don't have any planting plans at all. But this is what the team who were responsible for the soft landscaping went for when we restored the garden. So the planting plans included a sort of a 3-tiered planting scheme, which is basically a dark evergreen spine in the back, and then flowering shrubs in the middle, and then your sort of the box edging, as you can see here, on the outer edges of the borders. And what we're trying to achieve these days, because we do have this multi-layered history, if you like, of planting in the garden. So we've got Ongley's late Regency planting, we have Shuttleworth's more Victorian planting, and you have to try to present those two layers in a way that people understand, so it doesn't become too cluttered and too difficult and too confused. So what we're going for is around the borders of the garden, around the perimeter of the garden, which I suppose you might call a Regency walk. You have these borders which are planted in the more Regency style, and then within the centre of the garden, which is probably where Shuttleworth made more changes and included more rhododendrons and ferns and the Victorian style of planting, we can focus on that more in those areas so that it doesn't become too confused as a planting scheme. This is very much a work in progress still, because there is a lot of planting that came in during the county council's time, which may or may not be appropriate to the garden's historic brief. So, you know, it is a slow process, and we're still working on it, and the garden team are doing a really great job of that. And when we have our conservation management plan review, one of the things we'll be including in that is a review of the planting going forward, and how we should look at that in future, and how the garden team can work with the conservation management plan to ensure that the planting brief is maintained. And again, those views, the broad expanses of lawn, I haven't really shown too much of those yet, but there are lawns sitting between all those areas which unify the design and create those lovely vistas, those long views and vistas in the garden, which are so important to the design. We now have a sculpture walk in the Woodland Walk, which is, I think I mentioned earlier, adjacent to the lake. So these sculptures, there are 7 of them. They're created from cedar wood from the garden, and they tell the story of the Ongleys and the Shuttleworths and basically the creation of the garden. So the first one is the galleon, the ship, which is meant to represent the first Lord Sir Ongley, who created the estate, and he was a director of the East India Company, hence the ship. The ferns, the unfurling ferns, are meant to represent plants being brought into the garden from wherever around the world, an exotic plant. So again, and the fernery, of course, that the Shuttleworths brought in. And then the little cottage seat here represents the link between the garden and the village, and that very, very important story that Lord Ongley was trying to tell, that this is a Swiss landscape. It's not just a Swiss garden, there is a Swiss village as well, and also the importance and the links between the tenants of the village and the estate workers and Lord Ongley. So it was very much a relationship that enabled him to create the garden. So the sculpture walk is a very nice part in addition to the woodland walk, which just helps us to interpret the story in a nice way. And local school children were involved with actually coming up with these designs. And you can see Patrick, the sculptor there, who was responsible for creating them. This was reopening day, July 2014. This is when the garden was actually closed for 18 months during its restoration. And Princess Charlotte is the lady in red. She is the granddaughter of Dorothy Shuttleworth, and she doesn't live in this country anymore, but she comes over very regularly. And this was her opening the garden for us in July 2014, a very special day, a very sunny day. I remember it well, and a very proud day. And I'm just going to quickly skip through a couple of things that we've been doing in the garden to try to raise those visitor numbers and create new audiences. It's quite difficult we thought that maybe having something like a Regency garden party would be lovely, because it's a Regency garden and you've got all the Jane Austen fans who might come and take part. Sadly, it didn't really attract huge numbers, so it wasn't really, we tried for 3 years and we had about 150 people every time. It wasn't very successful, so that had to go. But while it happened, it was very, very nice. We all had a go at Regency dancing. We all dressed up. This is a family that came to the event. Everyone dressed up apart from the little boy. He obviously wasn't keen, but they really threw themselves into it, and it was a delightful event, but perhaps not one that attracts the bigger crowds. This, however, which we replaced it with, was an instant hit. And the first year, I think we had 900 people. The second year, we had over 1,000 people, and so on. And so we ran this for 3 or 4 years very successfully. And the first 2 years, the sun shone and it was beautiful weather. Unfortunately, the last couple of years, the weather did go a little bit pear-shaped, and we had April showers. And since obviously since COVID, we haven't been able to run large events, but it was a very successful event. We all got involved. My twin daughters here, Charlotte and Christina, they are here as Tweedledee and Tweedledum. This young lady, Helen, she was the daughter of our garden supervisor. She was obviously Alice in Wonderland. And then we had volunteers doing other roles, and people were invited to picnic in the garden. And this was a massively popular event because everybody loves Alice in Wonderland, and still very popular. Theatre, that always goes down well. That's always a popular one, and we still do theatre in the garden. And nowadays we're starting to do more drive-in cinema as well because of COVID restrictions. The drive-in air shows have been very, very popular, and we're starting to do more drive-in cinema. So people stay in their cars or have a square where they can park the car and then sit with their table just outside their car. So it's all COVID safe, and those are the sort of things we can do in lieu of this sort of crowded situation. And the Swiss Garden at Night was another very successful one. This has been growing for a few years now. It's actually now called Shuttleworth at Night because we don't just include the garden, we actually include the wider site as well. It goes up to the house now. But this is a beautiful event and a totally different perspective on the garden and you know, the trees lit up. It's absolutely beautiful, and we always look forward to this one. And I think we are planning to run it this year in October. We have a garden room now. This is a new build, which was included in the project because we felt that we needed somewhere to have, you know, the smaller events and activities. And so we can have small wedding parties in here. We can have birthdays. We can have activities such as wreath making. So it's a really useful space, and it also serves as an art gallery, an exhibition gallery as well. We've had display rails installed along the ceiling lines, and you can actually hang art in there, and that's a very lovely room for art exhibitions. Yeah, that's a really and an education room for schools to use as well. We've also introduced a well-being programme, so we have now several well-being activities taking place outdoors. So we have yoga, we have Tai Chi, we have mindfulness, and we have sound baths. And we actually ran an essential oils class last year as well, but that was indoors. So our well-being programme has been very well received, and of course now everybody is talking about the outdoors and well-being, and this works very, very well with that. So we've got all of these booked in for this year as well, all the outdoor ones, not so much the indoor ones. This is the Swiss Garden team. I wanted to introduce you to the team. On the top right, we have Sissel, our head gardener. She's from Norway. She has worked at Kew Gardens, and before coming to us, she managed a park in London. So she's very well trained and an excellent horticulturalist, and she's making a big difference to the garden. And we also have down on the bottom left, we have Steve, who is one of our gardeners, and Jackie, who is our trainee, and she's staying with us for a further 6 months, and we hope to keep her for a little bit longer. So we'll see how that goes. But she's excellent. She's taken to propagation like a duck to water. So we're hoping that she'll make a big difference to our plant sales. And she's also got a good eye for design and planting. So she's a real asset to the team. And of course, we have our wonderful volunteers. We have about 40 volunteers on the books, and they are all very, very dedicated. Obviously, they haven't all been able to be with us over the last year because of the various lockdowns, but they're all in touch, and they've now started coming back just in small groups for shorter periods of time, but they are now coming back, which is wonderful to see. And so finally, I'm just finishing off with a quick flick through the seasons for you. So the garden in spring, our speciality, if you like, our big wow factor for spring is the daffodils. And this year we are running a daffodil festival for the first time ever, where people can go around and identify certain daffodils. We were meant to be having tours and a talk, but unfortunately they've had to be cancelled because of the restrictions, but we will hopefully do those next year. Rhododendrons are also a highlight in spring, as is our rock garden in early spring, and several scented shrubs in late winter and early spring as well. So we've got quite a lot of spring delights, really, and it's all starting to look wonderful at the moment. Summer, it can be a little bit green sometimes for us in summer, late summer in particular, but early summer's really good. We've got some nice herbaceous borders being developed now, or beds rather. And obviously we have lots of urns and planters around the garden, which we do make the most of, and inside the grotto. So we try to make sure there's as much colour included as possible throughout the summer. And we're working on those months that don't have an awful lot of colour in them at the moment. So that's our plan for this year, is to inject more colour into the late summer. Autumn, very colourful. We're not a Stourhead or we don't have masses of colour, but we do have some really, really lovely trees, and obviously other things at ground level, like the colchicums, and in the rock garden as well, some autumn flowering bulbs, and it is rather beautiful. And one of our prize assets is our Acer, which is just fiery. Next to it we have the Robinia, which if we're lucky, we get a year when that is bright yellow and the Acer is bright red at the same time. But more often than not, the Acer has gone over before the Acer does its thing. But they are a lovely combination, and viewed from the Swiss cottage, stunning. And this is the garden in winter, or some snapshots of the garden in winter. Absolutely fairy tale like when we've had a dusting of snow, and we do have some lovely, we have the Lonicera, we have the snowdrops, we have some wonderful winter plants as well. So it is definitely still worth a visit in winter, especially when it's looking like this. And I just wanted to end with a lovely quote from a lady called Cecilia Ridley in 1839, who visited the garden, and this was how she described it. "We saw the most extraordinary garden in the world. In short, quite a fairyland." And I think that just sums up really how the Swiss garden feels to most of us who know it and love it. It is a fairyland. It is a very magical place, and it's described as a fairyland in quite a few of the contemporary accounts of the garden back in the 1830s, and I think it still holds that today. And I'm going to finish with our peacock. Thank you very much indeed. We have two peacocks. We have a white peacock and we have the wonderful blue one. They're called Storm and Snowy, and I'm sure they'd offer you a very warm welcome if you ever come to the Swiss garden. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Corinne. It has been amazing hearing from you, and it's amazing. I think everybody that is listening to us wants to go to the first opportunity got to go to the UK. They will obviously go and see the Swiss garden. I think it's fairyland, obviously. I think it's the quote that you left us in the end. I think it's perfect to describe the Swiss garden, and I think it was a really good talk, and we quite know well the Swiss garden and the restoration process. I think it's a part of that a lot of people don't know, those many layers, especially in the UK, where you get older gardens where you have very a lot of layers, a lot of people that go in and put things on the garden and add things to the garden, and I think you described it very, very well. Those layers until you get to the restoration, and then at the restoration you have to choose sometimes the what area or which area era do you want for the garden. I have a few questions, but if anyone wants to we are a bit late on our schedule, but if anyone wants to ask something to Corinne, they can write or they can raise their hand. But maybe you will start with a question about the volunteers that you talked, and I have been working. I worked in the UK in the past, and I know how important they are. We in Serralves have a tight group of 6 volunteers, and unfortunately for the last year they weren't able to work for the COVID reasons. But I think it would be nice to hear what is your perspective, of the how important it is for the garden, the work that the volunteers do.
It's incredibly important. I think we found during the first lockdown, when no volunteers at all were able to come to the garden for a few months, it makes a massive difference not having them on board. And also, we are able to give them tasks such as, I'm trying to think of an example now. We have several little signs around the garden which are made out of wood, and we have some volunteers who are really good at sort of restoring those for us. They go around painting them every year for us, and those sort of jobs just wouldn't get done if we didn't have volunteers. And on the gardening front, we have a small team. We have Cicel, the head gardener. We have Paul, Martin, Steve, and now Jackie, our trainee. And during the first lockdown, several of them were furloughed. So we had just Cicel and Steve and Jackie for, say, 3 or 4 months. And they were literally trying to cope with everything on their own. Now, when you have a small team, if you don't have volunteers, it takes the team away from some of the jobs that they need to be concentrating on. That's what we've found. So if the volunteers are able to take on, I don't like to say that they're always given the boring tasks, because they're not. We try to make sure that what they do is very varied, and we try to make sure that the experience is a learning experience as well. So they're learning new horticultural skills. They're not just doing the weeding, and they're not just raking up leaves, and that otherwise it gets very repetitive and very boring. But I just will say that when you have a small team, I'd say they're an essential part of the team. Essential. And also they bring in that community spirit as well, don't they? They're mostly local people, and some of them have got skills that we find surprisingly that we can use. Some of them are great with the creative side of things, like the crafts. So yes, I think they're essential, absolutely essential.
Do you think that was the most challenging thing during these times of I don't know if the Swiss Garden ever closed. Here in Porto we were closed twice. So once we started last year, and now the last two months. Were you closed, and that was the most challenging thing, the lack of gardeners and volunteers, and how did you cope with it?
We did close, but we retained a staff of 3 in the garden for the whole time. So the volunteers didn't come in during that time, but we still had Cicel, our head gardener, and we still had Steve and Jackie. So we always were able to maintain the garden. We had to prioritise areas though, so the grass cutting and, there had to be priority tasks, and then try not to look too hard at the weeds, I think, because, there's no way they could cope with it all. And it was the spring and summer season as well. So yes, it was quite challenging for them, and they had to turn a blind eye to some of it, but they prioritised the work very, very well. And to be honest, when we reopened in June, July last year, it still looked pretty good. It still, because of those priorities, it still looked pretty good. So they did very well.
And I personally, because I go every day. I still go every day to the garden, to Serralves. I see some changes because we don't have the public. Did you saw that changes in the garden, and those opportunities to do some things that you couldn't do if the public was if it was open to the public, and the lack of visitors increased something, or what was if there were any opportunities that arose when you were closed or during these times?
I think well, yes and no. I think one of the things that we noticed was how nature takes over. We have issues with muntjac deer in the garden, and when there are lots of visitors, the deer don't come too close. But during the lockdown, they sort of became very at home in the garden again. So we've had a bigger problem with the muntjac. They've become a little bit more comfortable in the garden, let's say, because it was so quiet and they were able to come in more. So I think nature and also maybe allowing certain areas not to be too manicured anymore. It was surprising that some of the areas in the garden actually looked quite nice when they weren't too manicured, because of that necessity of having to prioritize garden tasks. It meant that some areas we didn't get to, and I think we were surprised at how maybe we were too quick to rush to do those things in the past, and maybe we can leave things a bit longer, sometimes. So I think it has changed attitudes and perspectives of the garden, but because we had a gardening team in there the whole time, it wasn't too bad.
Okay, I had a similar problem with our sheep. They really enjoyed the herb garden this past few weeks. I can relate with the types of problems. You were talking about the funding. Obviously, you had a big funding in 2012. But at the moment, where do you in a normal time, where do your funding come from?
Well, in normal times, we're very fortunate to have the Friends of the Swiss Garden, and the Friends of the Swiss Garden, because they have 500 members who all pay a membership subscription every year. That money is able to go towards certain projects. So any restoration projects, for instance, I showed you the thatched tree seat in the garden that used to be there. Now the new seat was actually commissioned from a local joiner, and the Friends of the Swiss Garden helped to fund that. So that was probably about £3,000 to £5,000 in total, I think. And it's going back a few years now. So the Friends will fund some things. We've been very fortunate to have tapped into government funding because of the lockdowns, you know, the sort of rescue funds, if you like, and we're currently we've currently got some money towards a digital recovery, so that we're obviously transferring a lot of our marketing and online thing to online now, rather than doing it paper versions and print versions. So we are looking at our website, making our website more accessible. So those sorts of grants have been great. But normally we would look, I mean, we would still be able to apply to the Heritage Lottery Fund, you know, or it's not called that anymore. It's got a new name, which I can never remember, but they're the same people. So we could still put applications in for different projects around the site. There are some local funders, Bedfordshire-based funders, who will, you know, some of the funds that they can give out are quite large sometimes, and we've had help from them in the past. So I think there's a range of sources for funding, and that is, but I think that is going to become a little bit more challenging following the pandemic, I think, because I think there's a certain amount of money around and there's a lot of people who need it. So I think it's going to be more and more challenging.
Yeah, it's I can imagine it's the same thing here in Portugal, and if you rely a little bit of your funding with the tickets and ticket sales, obviously with no tourists, it's a big problem.
Yeah.
I don't know if again, if anyone wants to ask something, please please feel free to do so. But one last question from me, and then if in a historical garden, one of the main problems, at least what I'm from my experience, is the aging of the vegetation, especially trees, shrubs, and obviously Serralves was built almost 100 years ago, and a lot of our vegetation is starting to decline and get into a certain age of that we need to take care more of it, and sometimes take matters into our hands and a thing that we obviously don't like to do, but the safety is a priority. And how do you deal with that in the garden? Obviously, as 100 years more than Serralves. How do you deal with it? I think, from my experience in England, sometimes you are very radical to at a certain point. But how do you? What is your experience in the Swiss garden?
I think, okay, so yes, I agree with you. I think we can be quite radical sometimes. I know that when we restored the garden back in 2013 and 14, there was a massive tree surgery involvement with that. But the point is that the garden had grown beyond, it had grown out of its original design, and a lot of the key views and vistas had been lost. And I think it was necessary to renew those design points, but also a lot of the trees were quite diseased, you know. I think, and when the surveys were done, they were found to be quite dangerous, in fact, some of them. So we had to take quite a lot out, not only to open up the views, but for safety's sake as well. And I think climate change isn't helping with the tree situation, because we find that, for instance, when you have very dry summers and very wet winters, you get, you know, more incidents of limb drop, yeah, and diseases. And so we are finding that the costs of maintaining our trees, and you know, and that does involve felling on occasion, is becoming higher. And I think that is largely to do with climate change and not so much us being radical anymore. But there are also incidents, examples of trees that have to come down to protect buildings. So, for instance, we've got the Grotto Infernory, which is quite a large and glazed structure. And not too far away from that structure is a pine tree, and the cones are falling onto the grotto and breaking the panes. So you've got this lovely Victorian cylinder glass, which is being constantly broken because of the falling pine cones. So it's a tree that really isn't ideal for the location. And as you can't move the building, decisions have to be made then about what to do with the tree. And unfortunately, in this instance, it means we probably will have to fell the tree. But that doesn't mean we can't then plant another one somewhere else, you know. So, and as the trees are aging anyway, after this length of time, it's actually probably a good time to be thinking about renewal and starting to think about a planting strategy for those trees so that we have replacements going forward.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's one of the main concerns that we have at the moment. That's why I was asking you. If we don't have any more questions, I just would like to thank Corinne for your time, for your presentation. Again, I think everyone will be excited to go to the Swiss garden as long as we can travel, and everyone is eager to travel. So I think you will have a lot of visitors from Portugal, once again, thank you very much for this. And obviously, you have an open invitation to come to Porto, to come to Serralves, and see our garden from yourself. Para terminar, eu só queria agradecer a presença de todos terem estado aqui presentes nesta conversa. Novamente, eu queria agradecer ao mecenas do Parque, a Sonai, e lembro que a conversa terá a temática Democracia Digital, um regresso à democracia de Atenas. Convidados será Miguel Bonjardino e Paulo Rangel, e com a moderação de Catarina Botelho. Muito obrigado e uma boa noite.